Once we finish painting the rads, we test them again. We test them when we receive them, either if we're buying them or refurbishing them from a client. When we send them to get sandblasted, we test them again. And after they're painted, we test them one final time before we rat them to send them out. What I'm using here is Teflon tape, which I will use to help with the seal. And then I'll also use sealant as well. Sometimes you can just throw the pipe dope on there and it ends up leaking. So I just wrap it every time, just to make sure I'm not wasting my time. Whenever you're working with chemicals of any kind, it's a good idea to use gloves. Now, less is more with this stuff. You don't need a whole lot, especially when you're using the Tef tape at the same time. If you're using the pipe dope, when you insert the pipes and you get runoff coming out, you've used too much. We'll be testing this guy over here. Beautiful rad in pewter by Modern Masters. It's the paint color. You want these tight, but you don't want to over tighten them because you can stretch the threads and the bushings themselves. The nipples I don't mind if they get run down because I'll just cut them and rethread them. But this is a finished rad. I don't want to strip the threads. Tighten them till about, like you'll get a feel for it, but you tighten them till about they're really resisting you, and that should do the trick. So once those are installed, we need a pressure gauge. A little bit of dope for these as well. You don't need much at all for this part, just a thin coat. And this one you just hand tighten in. Once the rad is ready to be tested, we fill it to about 40 psi, usually just a bit over. Right about there. And I go over, and then after about 15 minutes I come back and check, and if it's dropped below the 40 psi mark, I'll just put a little bit more in there, then I know that there's a leak somewhere. Now, when there is a leak, I test all the connections. We have just soap and water usually, because you spray the connections here, and the nipples I've installed, and if it's making bubbles, then you know you have a leak. Now, if your connections are not leaking, but you're still losing pressure, generally that doesn't happen at this stage, but if we're testing a new rad and the connections are strong, but you still have a leak somewhere, it might be one of the gaskets. As they dry out, they don't form a perfect seal, so the next step would be to pressure test with water. Again, just fill it up with water, about 40 psi, leave it. I'll put cardboard underneath, and if I come back to it and there is actually a leak in the gaskets, I'll see on the cardboard where the water is dripping from. But generally with those, once you water test it and rehydrate the gaskets, that generally will fix that problem. If that doesn't work, then you know that you have a leak somewhere else, and then it gets a bit more complicated. So it's been about 15 minutes. As you can see, it's still right where I left it. So this rad is still ready to go, and now that we've tested it one last time, it's ready to be wrapped and sent on its way.